I'm not going to be formal at all unless you want me to. But my other family connection is that this one?
Yeah, to move forward.
My other family connection is that I have 5 sons, and my 3rd son has been living in Alaska for 18 years. Originally in the bush, in St. Michael and Nulato as a teacher, and now at a native model school in Fairbanks. So I do have a lot of connections out here, and I love being in Alaska at any opportunity. I will be pretty informal. I do have a PowerPoint thing that'll be a little bit useful for you, I think, but I hope I'll just roll along with more of an informal talk about public diplomacy, and then we can all talk about it. But the purpose of this really is first to define and explain to you what public diplomacy is, and then suggest what I think, or how I think it could really apply for the Arctic, not just for Alaska, but for the 8 Arctic countries. That's really what we're going to try to do here. Now, I'm sort of curious how many of you think, I'm not going to call on you, so if you want to put your hand up, that's fine. How many of you think you know what public diplomacy is? So there's a half, 6 of you. It's a very amorphous subject, and I will first talk about it a little bit, and then all of a sudden I hope it'll be very clear for you. And I'm going to screw this up right away, but you could also, so that's the title that I decided might be useful for you. You could also say that the equally good title would be, would a strategy of public diplomacy spoil the Arctic? It isn't necessarily always positive, and I think that's something that you should have in your mind as we go through this. What I will tell you about public diplomacy is it's less than 60 years old as a concept. It happened to be coined at the Fletcher School. And it happens to be very fashionable right now. By chance, I'm going from here to Korea, and the reason I'm going to Korea is to give a lecture to the Foreign Ministry about public diplomacy in Korea. And later on this month, I'm going to Armenia for a week of public diplomacy with the Diplomatic Institute in Armenia, of all places. So it's something that is quite fashionable, and there are a lot of different ways to slice and spice it, I would say. Okay, let's see if this works. Now, a lot of, in previous times, a lot of people would think that what is now used to be public diplomacy was simply propaganda. These are old classics of propaganda, which the first one was a very important filmmaker for the Nazis. Obviously, you know about Tokyo Rose during World War II, and then that moved on to Radio Moscow and The Voice of America in the first years of the Cold War. And I'm going to go through these very quickly. Now it is called public diplomacy. These are elements of it when it got started. And you could even say Alaska Airlines is one function, is part of public diplomacy for your state right now. I mentioned the China's Confucian language centers today. There are 60 of them in the US, 60 different Confucian centers in the US. The US right now does not have one cultural library or cultural center in China, by contrast. Okay, this is a little bit better. Forget that damn graphic, it's awful. But propaganda, which was certainly spinning and even lying for effect, turned into public relations, which was spinning for smiles and for sales, into public diplomacy, which really is the purpose of winning hearts and minds. There's a simple way of thinking about it. A couple of quickies. As I told you, it's under the name of Edward R. Murrow, who turned from being a wonderful journalist, as most of you probably know, to then being the head of the USIA during President Kennedy. and he wasn't very popular in that role. He only continued for less than 3 years, and he also privately was the first time in the Kennedy administration that was complaining about the prospect of us getting involved in Vietnam. And after doing that privately, he decided to get out of the government. He came to the Fletcher School. He smoked a lot, as you've seen, and he sadly died fairly soon thereafter because of lung cancer. The dean of Fletcher originally coined the phrase, and that is the words that he used when he coined the phrase public diplomacy. I won't read it again, you can all read it, but that was the original definition of public diplomacy. There's probably 250 different definitions now. The one that I found myself using is this. Programs, programming, and dialogue to favorably influence and impact public attitudes regarding a nation, its values, and by extension, its policies. All right, let's move on to the more interesting things. This is going to take a little time to figure it out, not to figure it out, but to absorb it, better way to put it. As I've already told you, public diplomacy per se started at the height of the Cold War, and we're now in the time where the thing that's most often used about public diplomacy is a form of soft power. Many of you may have read the book by Joe Nye about soft power, and so it's interesting that it's moved from Cold War to soft power. In the beginning, and the main point I want to get across with all this language is that in the beginning, public diplomacy was perceived and conceived as only programs of governments undertaken by governments such as Voice of America to influence other publics. And so it was seen, including at the Fletcher School, as strictly a government activity. It isn't anymore, and we'll go into this in a big way, but in my view today, it has been almost completely privatized in the sense that most programs of public diplomacy are undertaken deliberately, or most times not deliberately, unconsciously almost, by different aspects of the private sector. And that overall, Microsoft, whether as a computer product or as a computer software, or Gates Foundation giving work to AIDS activities in Africa, is far more important to the way foreign publics look at the U.S., good, bad, or otherwise, than government programs. That's my simple point. But in the beginning, these are the types of things that governments, when they sort of moved on from Voice of America and Radio Moscow, they moved into other more subtle ways of radio and TV that they sponsored. They moved into things like Olympic Games, that's pretty obvious. They moved into campaigns like the Peace Corps. I love to talk about Juan Valdez and Café de Colombia, because at the height of when Colombia was seen as all narco-terrorism and narco-politics, they decided that the big product they had and that would impact the world positively was the quality of their coffee and the image of Juan Valdez and his donkey. And you still see it today. Lufthansa and a lot of other airlines only use Café de Colombia for quite a while. And that's just a more, a smaller example. And there are other things that have been much more ad hoc. And I like to talk about the fact that, I just think it's significant that when Fidel Castro offered to send Cuban doctors to New Orleans after Katrina, when you really think about it, we might have been, as Americans, initially sort of uncomfortable about that. But that was a great example of Cuba pushing forward something that they're very proud of, namely their health system, and putting it onto the big U.S. in many different ways, and it clearly had an impact on the way some Americans felt about Cuba. The other example is Hugo Chavez, which you may or may not know, but at the height of the oil difficulties in the Northeast, he started promoting cheaper oil to Boston and Chicago, and it had a very positive impact. There's a lot of data that after the big tsunami or in the typhoon in Southeast Asia, the U.S. really went the U.S. military spent a lot of people into Sumatra and other places to help the Indonesians in the cleanup for that, and it was very clear at the height of bad feelings about the U.S. generally speaking around the world because of the war in Iraq. It became very clear that the public opinion to the U.S. in Indonesia raised quite within 6 months of the time of the military being there in a very positive way. So those are the kind of things that governments have undertaken. Now, what I have made the point is that I think it's really been privatized in many ways. And here are some examples of how, and I use the phrase that they're passive-aggressive practitioners of public diplomacy. I'm sure all of you know about Al Jazeera. I'm sure most of you felt in the beginning that Al Jazeera was kind of a negative anti-U.S. media enterprise from the Gulf. And I suspect that almost all of you feel differently now who pay attention to the Middle East. I feel very positive about Al Jazeera in terms of how well they're reflecting events in the Middle East in ways that Western journalists such as myself cannot possibly do. And that is one example. The way certain multinationals, I mentioned Nestle because in the beginning Nestle had a terrible image internationally, and it changed it because it realized how lousy its image was. It turned it around a lot, particularly in Africa with the children milk thing, and it wasn't initiated by the government of Switzerland to do that. It did it themselves, and it had a very, in my view, a very positive impact on the government of Switzerland. There's a lot of different examples. The NGOs that I happen to mention, Amnesty, Oxfam, Red Cross, Sierra Club, I think it's clear to all of you that those enterprises have a big impact on. Oxfam happens to come from the UK, and Red Cross originally came from Switzerland, but they have a very big impact on the way, in this case, Western countries, but sometimes quite specific countries, have how people react to these enterprises. There are religious and cultural activities of all kinds. There are foundations. I've already met the Gates Foundation and others. There are events, new types of events, not Olympics. The Iditarod itself clearly has a big impact on how the rest of the U.S. and other parts of the world feel about Alaska, and I think mostly positive. In fact, almost entirely positive. Yeah.
I was just going to say, sir, so you said like things that are intentionally public diplomacy and also things that are unintentional.
Correct.
Public diplomacy.
Correct.
How do you determine then, I mean, would you say that anything that has some type of international influence or international viewing, in that case, is some type of public diplomacy then?
More, I'd say it more yes than not. I mean, I'd draw the line somewhere, but you're closer to the, my basic point here is that public diplomacy is a range of activities that influence how other populations and countries look at the host country, and that it is absolutely not mostly government initiated any longer. Governments don't have the integrity to do it. Certainly the US didn't after Iraq. And I will get more subtle about it in a minute. It's a good question, because I will tell you that the government of Korea, where I'm going in a couple of days, they are not going to be at all popular about what I'm going to tell them about this, because my basic point is that government activities don't cut it by and large, and the government of Korea right now isn't prepared to hear that. That's not the way they think about it. It is generally true that the larger the country, the more complicated the public diplomacy message becomes, generally speaking. But it's a good question. I like to talk about movies and the impact that movies can have on impressions that you have. I don't know how many of you saw the wonderful movie about Indonesia, The Year of Living Dangerously, but that probably had more impact on Indonesia, good, bad, and otherwise, for an 8 or 10 year period in the Western world than almost any other single thing. Robbie and I were talking about Big Miracle, the documentary about the whale here, and I guess it didn't have much of an impact, even though it might have. When you think about this, and if you generally accept what I'm saying, you kind of come to the conclusion that it's a very crowded and competitive landscape. And because there's a phrase that somebody has used that I think is useful, saying the market for loyalty that is becoming ever more, his name is Monroe Price, and he wrote a book about it, and I think it's a concept, I mean, it's a useful concept. And in the current world, there is so much noise, there is so much din, that to stand out from the crowd in any way is ever more difficult. And that's true of public diplomacy as much as anything else. And governments, to be at all effective in it, have to really figure it out, have to think about it and understand that, and don't think that they can just put 1 or 2 programs together and that's going to change opinions in a big way over a short period of time. It's just not going to happen. Any more questions about this, and then I'll start talking about the Arctic itself. Yeah, please.
When is it public diplomacy? If country you're going to, just give an example of going to Korea or somewhere. What happens if they're not listening to what you have to say? Is that still public diplomacy?
Then it's unpublic diplomacy. I don't want to be a smart ass, but I mean, you can't control that sometimes. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And there's a lot of, I want to make the point again though, when I say public diplomacy has been privatized, so to speak, it doesn't mean that most of these enterprises are deliberately trying to be public diplomacy people for their governments. The point is that it's happening by what they're doing and by their natural activity and rhythm, rather than being a very deliberate activity per se. It's often secondary to what their primary mission is. Yeah.
It seems like the historical progression of public diplomacy, as you kind of laid it out, is that it started as governments because they had the most power and influence, and then it kind of turned to private organizations and they took over. Now, would you say today, with the level of communications technology, that we're almost having true public diplomacy to a point? Because we have, for instance, YouTube,
Yes.
Facebook, where, I mean, I can put a video on YouTube, me personally, and if I get enough hits, it will be seen by people all around the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're right. And we talked about that this morning in another context, but absolutely the world of, let's simply call it the intermediate, I like to call it the intermediate world, has just changed the rules of that very, very much. Okay. So that doesn't tell you much of anything. Let's see what we got up here. That's not what I want up there, but it's close. I want you to think about this as key assets and handicaps for the Arctic. And if you look at 3 of these lines, yes, number 1 is true. We all know it. You could say that in the perception of people that do not live in the Arctic, that is more bad than good. You could easily conclude that. You could see it either way. I happen to see it positively, but it could be seen negatively. The second one, rich in mineral resources, etc. There is a negative part of that, which a lot of the world outside of the Arctic feel that there are mostly just predatory companies up here trying to exploit these resources. And they may or may not want the resources themselves, but they think of it as the private sector, unregulated and uncontrolled. The last thing, the new global attention due to resources. There's another part of that, which is a lot of people in the non-Arctic part of the world think of a commotion of loud environmentalists demanding indigenous peoples. They have a negative reaction to this. And the bottom of all this, in my opinion, the real key to the whole thing, assets and handicaps, but really we want more to talk about assets, is there's lack of knowledge about the Arctic and the different elements of the Arctic in most of the rest of the world. And that's something, for a variety of reasons now, is changing, and it has to be changed pretty quickly. And I think it will change more positively and more organically by public diplomacy of the way we've defined it than any other thing, which is part of my main message. These are some of the things that you could think about a public diplomacy program for the Arctic. And I'm not only talking about Alaska, let me make that very clear. I'm talking about Arctic countries, circumpolar countries. Most of us think of it as 8. And obviously there's a wonderful level of international science activity and discovery up here. And there's some very positive things that can come of that over time. I won't go into that because I'd say it's pretty obvious. If the lack of knowledge is a key part of the problem, obviously promoting site visits by scholars, by scientists, by journalists from other parts of the world, that's the key to the whole thing. Not just the same community of people from Norway coming here and Finland coming there. That's not going to cut it. It's people that know very little about the Arctic until they're up here and smell it and see it and taste it. And I think that's pretty obvious. It's remarkable to me for a whole variety of reasons, but certainly native arts, literature, and to a degree cinema, but particularly native arts and literature, is a remarkable thing of Alaska and of other parts of the Arctic that I have been to. I don't know Russia quite so well. I've been to Russia plenty of times, but I don't know Arctic Russia as well as I do Norway and Sweden and places like that. But I would say it's a generality that's accurate. You could talk about an Arctic Peace Corps, and I think there could be a lot of different ways that in, let's say, a group of Arctic countries could talk about an Arctic Peace Corps. Now, the denouement of all this is this. In my view, the Arctic Council, how many of you here know the Arctic Council? So a lot of people don't. Well, that's important that you will in 2 minutes here. The Arctic Council is less than 20 years old. As I said up there, it was started by a Canadian foundation, really. It's 16 years old, I think, now. It is the 8 countries that either their land is over the Arctic Circle or touching it. And it's Russia, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Greenland, Canada, US. That is the Arctic Council. It is very young, which is a very good thing. It is very remarkable already for the second item you see there. And there have been a range of different, primarily scientific activities through the Arctic Council about ice, about weather, about navigation in ice situations, about resource stewardship, etc. It's quite remarkable in that up until now, it is operating by consensus. There is no president per se, and up until last year, there was no headquarters and no secretariat. and yet all these fairly positive things were happening out of it. More important, from a political or geopolitical point of view, number one, it has become a place where the big powers, in this case primarily the US and Russia, can be on even standing with much smaller countries, and they're all operating in a very balanced fashion. The fact that there hasn't been a president, there hasn't been a headquarters, et cetera, is part of it, I would say. There was a 2-year discussion within the Arctic Council as to should there be a headquarters. Have we come of age to the point that we've got to have a headquarters and a small secretariat, et cetera? And where did they finally determined to do that, and where did it end up being? In Tromsø, Norway, which is a quarter the size of, probably a fifth of the size of Anchorage, and it's above the Arctic Circle. But it wasn't going to be in Moscow, it wasn't going to be in Washington, it wasn't even going to be in Ottawa. In fact, it wasn't even going to be in Oslo itself. And they put it there, and I think that's very remarkable and positive, in my view. The real thing, the bottom line is the real thing that I personally feel very positive about, and secondly, I think it could be the basis for a truly Arctic public diplomacy program, which there are two things about the Arctic Council that is already sort of visible. And one is that up until now, it is more for cooperation than confrontation between these 8 countries. And just think of the two piggies in this, Russia and the US, and they're operating in a very cooperative fashion, by and large. I'm speaking by and large, which is both for the benefit of mankind itself, or the globe, and for 2 reasons. It's becoming ever more apparent how climate change in the Arctic is impacting the rest of the globe. All of you have been reading about that up here, and it's certainly true that that's filtering down into the lower 48, that what is happening up here, both on permafrost and other things, is having a direct and indirect impact on the rest of climate change that is not here. It's ever more apparent that the mineral resources in the Arctic collectively represent, number one, a huge resource for the world, number two, a huge resource that could be exploited badly. And I may be a little too Pollyannish about it, but I happen to sense that the Arctic Council itself is becoming a real proper international steward of the way the resources of the Arctic are handled. The Arctic Council was relatively, they were quite instrumental between some agreements between Norway and Russia about fisheries up there, and about the first Norwegian oil rigs in Russian waters, which started a year ago. I mean, it's pretty remarkable when you think about it. I mean, they've gone beyond or around, or whatever the hell the verb you want to use, normal, narrow, sovereign interests to more collective interests about bigger, important things that go across borders and have an impact on the rest of the world. And I don't happen to like the phrase, it's a UN phrase, but it is kind of a global commons. And the last thing is pretty obvious, I think, now that I've talked the way I have, is that one could argue, and I will argue, that if the Arctic Council keeps going in the direction it is, it can be a true model for the rest of the world in terms of how groups of countries could operate together in primarily favorable ways that benefit not only themselves but benefit the rest of the world. So in my way of thinking, the Arctic's a pretty special place right now. The world has suddenly opened up to it. Governments themselves have done something quite favorable internally, sort of below the radar, bad, given the due thing and so forth. That's probably a bad phrase, but below the radar of the rest of the world, most of what you all know about or you've heard about from me now is just not known in the lower 48 or other places. And there's pretty much nothing but positive impacts out of this, both regionally and internationally, if things continue to go in the way it's beginning to go now. And I say beginning to go. It's very new, it's an adolescent group, and so far so good. That's the end of my sermon from the Mount, or non-Mount. Yeah?
So in post-World War II Europe, the kind of predecessor to the European Union and the Eurozone, you had the combining of the heavy industries of Europe. German coal and iron and French German coal and iron, they all kind of unified together in an economic cohesion to kind of prevent war in Europe again. Do you see this possibly coming as economically intertwined, or do you see it as more of a collaboration that would just make it so there won't be conflict over the Arctic? Or do you see this as turning into some type of economic union of the Arctic's resources?
You've asked a bunch of great questions today, to your credit. And no, I do not see it. I don't see the parallel when I really think about it. And I don't think that would be desirable. My view, and I may be dead wrong, I'd be interested in what Robbie and others think. I may be dead wrong in telling you answering the way I am, but the Arctic countries so far are pretty innocent in the respects we're talking about. The European countries were anything but innocent in any way. They were, and that's point one. Point two, my own sense is I don't think the concept of a monetary union of any kind would be realistic and therefore would happen. There are a lot of other issues, and we had a conference about this at the Fletcher School in April, and there was a very, very good, extremely good, smart Russian sort of policymaker, combination policymaker and scholar, who knows an awful lot about Arctic Russia. And he brought up the point in the discussion about the Arctic Council that it may very well be good that the rest of the world didn't know anything about it. And the less is known about it, the better, the more innocent it will stay. And one could argue that. And that's why the other title of this talk that I said in the very beginning, would it spoil the Arctic? But I don't see any of the kind of thing. Yes, please.
I was wondering, do you think you see a future alignment with the UN?
Say again?
Do you see like a future alignment with someone such like the UN and the Arctic Council? Where it would be
I hope not. I mean, I've had a lot of dealings with the UN. It's too big, it's too complicated, it's too bureaucratic, and they're a hell of a lot better if they just sort of stand on the sidelines and say we don't want to be part of.
Do you think they should give them power to make stuff for the Coyote, or that, or treaties, or like a legislative aspect of it? Or is it going to be just purely the public servants of the propaganda aspect?
I wish I knew the answer for one sense. Of the 8 countries, I don't know how many, I suspect that 7 of them have already ratified the Kyoto Protocol, everybody but the US. I think I'm probably right in saying that. And therefore, I guess my thought is that, yes, things like that already exist and that are appropriate for the Arctic is a positive thing. I wouldn't see it as negative. Now, obviously, the U.S. loves to go its own way, and I'm not sure how far I want to go with this, but I think Hillary Clinton is, you may or may not know, but she's the first Secretary of State in the U.S. that has ever attended a Arctic Council meeting. And that was a big deal for the other countries that she went to Nuuk, Greenland last year in July. And that was a big deal. The fact that John Kerry and others is really trying to renew the U.S. to ratify the Law of the Seas. We're the only country of the Arctic Council that haven't ratified it. It's ridiculous. I don't want to get into that, but it's ridiculous. And one might say, in fact, I hadn't even thought about it right now, and I'm not sure I think about it tomorrow morning when I get up, but one could say that the Arctic Council would pull the U.S. in directions it ought to damn well be. Because there are other things to think about the Arctic Council. Number one, virtually, more or less, every country is democratic. It's small enough in numbers that you can deal with it. There's an old military thing, several of you are military guys, that you can never functionally work well with more than 8 people. There are 8 countries. And every one of these countries have an indigenous population of one kind or another, as Daley certainly knows. And all of these things make it pretty special, in my view. Yeah, it just plain does. Let me get some others from over here. Daley, did you want to ask?
Well, I just wanted to respond to your reference to this as an extraordinary example for other regions in the world.
Right.
And I think that one of the reasons why there's such collaboration and such consensus is that key issues like national security are not on the table in the Arctic Council, and economic development.
I agree.
Is not on the table. The other important dynamic is the role of the permanent participants, the indigenous peoples that you've just now referenced with regard to the Arctic 8 states. And I would venture to say that we would propel public diplomacy even further if those respective indigenous peoples and nations had a greater say in the work of the Arctic Council. They have extraordinary ability through the consensus framework of the Arctic Council to have influence over what their respective nation states do, or collectively the Arctic 8 nation states do. But I would argue that over time they've gained so much more control over their own destiny, either through self-government or public government, and direct responsibility for lands, territories, and resources, that their position in the context of the Arctic Council ought to be broadened so that they play a much more direct role. And it links in part to the comment that you made about the lack of knowledge about the Arctic. I mean, the Arctic indigenous peoples and the depth of knowledge about the region itself, the species, the whole ecosystem would help to propel it much further as well. So I just wanted to point out at least those 2 comments.
I agree with almost everything you said, and not because I'm politically correct. I'm not politically correct, but I happen to agree with you for 2 reasons, practically and theoretically. Because number one, there's no doubt anybody that's spent much time in the Arctic knows that the native, indigenous native groups know a huge amount of wisdom about the Arctic and the resources up here, wildlife, everything. And therefore, not just mythology, but knowledge that other people don't. There's an awful lot to be learned, point 1. Point 2, it would make the Arctic Council even more special. Point 3, as you and I talked earlier today, and this may sound, well, you said it wasn't politically incorrect. I thought you were going to take my head off when I mentioned it to you, but I happen to have been around the world an awful lot, and in the developing world a lot over the last 30, 40 years. And I was saying to Daley that my observation is that the indigenous populations in the Arctic have much more of a voice than any other part of the world that I think of indigenous groups. And I thought she might really lamb me for that, and she didn't. She happened, I think you said you were correct with me. I mean, you agree with me. The other thing to your point, which is terrific, is part of the, and I should have made it, you made it exactly right, and I should have said it earlier. The Arctic Council came from the bottom up. It didn't come from the bottom down. It didn't have security and territorial issues in the beginning. It came primarily as a scientific organization, and then it kind of moved into these other things. And that's pretty special. It was started by a foundation, and it wasn't started by a group of government guys getting together and over coffee or martinis, and it just didn't start that way, and it didn't start with bureaucratic thinking. And it's pretty remarkable when you think about it, and I'm glad you reminded me of that. I knew it, and I just didn't mention it. Robbie?
May I just ask a question? I think that the Arctic Council, because it's a forum and it's not, it's a group of nations that don't make decisions unless there's complete consensus, is an important point. But the public diplomacy and some of the issues that you've talked about, I think that the tensions are starting to grow a bit as China and the EU and some non-Arctic, you could argue non-Arctic related countries on the globe and areas of the globe want to become permanent members now to the Arctic Council. And so the debate is starting to build among the Arctic Council 8 and others as to whether these outsiders, these other nations, should play a role and have a voice. And I'd be curious to hear what you have.
Well, you're right.
to say.
I mean, I don't know if you all heard it, but there are Korea, China, Japan, and others are all trying to get some part of this for a variety of different reasons. From what I know, and you may know more than I do, that the 8 countries are pretty clear in their heads that now a lot of these countries will get what's it called? Not participant, there's a phrase. Excuse me? Yeah, observer. And I think that's fine. But it seems to me 2 reasons. Number one, they have this special kernel to bank on, namely the Arctic Circle itself. Now, technically, 2 of those countries actually don't touch the Arctic, or they don't have land in the Arctic Circle. They're very close to it, but that is the kernel, for one thing. I think, certainly what I've learned from my discussions, obviously off the record or informally with the Norwegians and the Swedes, is they all are aware that that's a movement and none of them want to move with it. They think they're quite happy the way they are. So that's what I think was probably what's going to come out. Sir?
Just a bit of confusion for me with the Arctic Council. Is it a government organization still, or is it still a private foundation? It's almost like...
No, it's government. I mean, it's
sanctioned by the government?
yes.
Okay.
It's very interesting, this foundation. I'll just tell you a very little bit about it, but I know one of the founders of it, who happens to live in Boston and was at the conference we had at Fletcher, and has written an essay about it, how it started. But basically this foundation, back 20 years, a little bit more than 20 years, said, we've got to, they're from Canada, as I think I said, we've got to do something for Canada here. Canada isn't sort of, it doesn't have a lead around the world in a lot of things except the Mounties and the ice hockey. And they started this idea of a grouping of Arctic countries. They didn't call it the Arctic Council. They didn't even really know what they were talking about in the beginning. And it took them 8 to 10 years to start getting people together, and out of these discussions, this began to come up as a concept. The big issue that they had in the beginning is the US didn't want to participate and didn't want to do it. And they realized pretty quickly that without the US getting part of it, it was not a full, really, it wasn't probably going to work out. And over time, without pushing it, the US began to feel a little bit left out if they didn't participate. The US originally, it's all in this article, and I've forgotten some of the details, but the US didn't call it the Arctic Council the first 2 years. It was you may remember what it is. They had some, way of getting involved without saying that they were part of an Arctic Council. And then that got comfortable enough, and then they, 16 years ago, announced it as the Arctic Council. But it's very interesting the way it happened, but it is very much government now. Foundation doesn't have enough money, and they don't have enough horsepower to do anything more with it. Others? Yeah.
I'm just wondering about tension perhaps among the 8. For example, Russia just kicked USAID out of its country. And so I'm wondering, and that's not specifically an Arctic
Yep.
issue, but how does that affect the interplay of the 8 countries?
Well, there certainly are tensions between these countries periodically. I don't mean to say that this is all a bed of roses. There are definitely and there are territorial issues in the Arctic, as everybody up here knows. My impression is because it was bottom up, which is the point that it wasn't top down, because it was bottom up, because the benefits are so clear to people, because it is consensus decision making, and because so far they've stayed away from any classical security issues, that they'll have their arguments in one level, and they're very happy to feel cooperative and everything else in the Arctic Council concept. That's my sense of it. Oddly enough, you'll probably be surprised, I don't know, but I've been surprised. The one country that is the least cooperative right now for a particular period of time is Canada. And it's because the current Prime Minister of Canada is very resource-oriented. It's not the Northwest Passage, nothing to do with the Northwest Passage, but all the other countries privately are a little irritated by the Canadians right now. And I think it's a temporary thing. I don't think it will last long. The other thing to remember is that, I don't know, it's pretty funny when you think about it, but positive. But all of you, I would imagine, have very positive associations with the Scandinavian countries. They give foreign aid, the amount of money that the Scandinavian countries give to foreign aid in Africa and other parts of the world is, on a per capita basis or a GNP basis, is by far the largest in the world. And so these are 3 very progressive countries about global responsibilities. As I said already, 7, arguably 8 of the countries are truly democratic. There's a lot of pretty new things. And my sense is that the people, that the governments involved are realizing the value of this way over some of the individual issues that are going to come in the lower 48, so to speak. We've done an index about this using 45 different variables. I won't talk a whole lot about it, but we're comparing the 8 Arctic Council countries through resource indicators, infrastructure indicators, and most importantly, the social indicators, and seeing how balanced they are. And the most difficult thing we had in doing that accurately was how could we, in the situation of Russia and to a degree Canada, how could we get figures and data that only applied to Arctic Russia as compared to all of Russia, to Arctic Canada versus all of Canada. And they're almost like different countries to some degree. And we found a way to do it, not perfectly, but it's pretty good, I would say. Obviously, in the case of the US in an index like that, it's very simple because Alaska's it. And Alaska has its own figures, and more or less. But in answer to your question, Paolo, I guess I feel that the Arctic psyche sometimes overcomes national psyches. And yeah, I don't think it's going to be an issue in the long term. Other things. Robbie, you may want to say some things, or somebody else may. I mean, Robbie is doing her PhD on this subject. Yeah, you say anything you want to. Be better than what I said.
I would just be curious, from your perspective, since the Arctic Council is nothing is agreed to unless all 8 countries agree that it will happen, whether it's a search and rescue agreement or otherwise, that, and we know from other international organizations that are consensus-driven groups like the WTO and others, that communication and storytelling and the narrative about the Arctic can be complicated because they don't agree that that there should be a communication policy. So I guess my question is two-part. One, I think you would agree that the United States, among all Arctic nations, probably knows the least about the Arctic.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And two, if it's the Arctic Council's responsibility to communicate the importance of the Arctic strategically and otherwise, what advice can we give the Arctic Council that must agree to this by all Arctic nations? What advice can we give them on how best to communicate that story and the importance of the Arctic?
I think it's very important. It's an excellent question. I haven't thought enough about it. I like the word narrative a lot. I think a lot of it should revolve around a small n narrative. In the last half hour or 45 minutes, we've been talking about an amazing series of positive things, and that's a hell of a narrative to put together. Obviously, you need various, even if you've got a good narrative, you've got to get the narrative told by different types of people and different types of media. And we all know as communicators that if you get too far ahead with your media, you're gonna blow the whole thing. It's very easy to get ahead of yourself, and it's a pretty important thing you're asking. I mean, it's a very important thing you're asking. I like spontaneous combustion a lot, I think. Yeah, I guess I ultimately think that the story would be better if it wasn't gotten too organized about it, because the story is so good and people want to know good, positive stories. And like it or not, the rest of the world is finding out about the Arctic because of both the permafrost and methane and climate change, and because of resources. To me, I mean, when I started getting involved in this, I was shocked, and I don't know how many of you actually know this figure. I used it up there, but that more than 30% of the world's untapped mineral resources are in the Arctic, which represents, and it's very hard to get. You go to Google or Wikipedia or anybody and try to get how much is the Arctic land and water, how much of the globe does it represent, and it took me a lot of time. It's not an easy figure to get. It seems to be about 2.5% of the globe. That's what it appears to be. So you're talking about 30% or 1/3 of the mineral resources of the world in 2.5% of the world. Well, right away, that means it's going to be on the front burner more and more. I got to really think about it. Please.
I was struck by two things. The first is the analogs between what's going on with the Arctic Council and what happened with the Antarctic Treaty System are fairly striking.
Yes.
The Antarctic Treaty System was
Yes.
established at a time before there was any overt interest in resource development.
Yep.
In the Antarctic. It's consensus driven and sort of bifurcated between consultative and non-consultative members. And it just seems to me that it can be a very instructive experience for the Arctic as the Arctic Council matures. But the other component piece is listening to your description of the need for the vacuum that exists with American understanding, United States understanding of the Arctic. It seems to give a huge opportunity for the people of Alaska who have more direct Arctic experience than any other group in the country to take a leading voice. And I was trying to loop this back into your notion of what public diplomacy can be. Isn't there a special responsibility as well as a special role for the state and for the people of Alaska?
Well, the answer, yes. On that, yes. And in terms of that, I mean, I'd have to think about it a lot in terms of how you would operational it, but one of Alaska's difficulties is going to be overcoming, let's call it the Jack London psyche, that there are so many other wonderful images of Alaska, mostly wonderful in the lower 48, that are far less important in real terms than what you're talking about. In terms of the Antarctic, I don't know enough about it. It's a very good point, but don't forget that there is no population there. That's a huge, there's a no native population. And obviously the whole thing was created, there was no functional democracies that were in place in the land. No people and no, so there's a difference there. I don't have enough knowledge, simply stated.
Well, I'll just add to that, and this was something Crocker and I were talking about earlier today. In 2 years' time, the United States
Yeah,
will
good,
become
I'm glad you
chair
mentioned
of
it.
the Arctic Council. It
Everybody hear that?
rotates in 2 years. So currently it's Sweden, it rotates to Canada, then to the United States by 2015. And it would be, to your point, Ethan, it would be our opportunity as Alaskans to make ourselves known through the U.S. chairmanship and to really take the lead in offering the Arctic story.
Let me say something else, and this may sound, I mean, apropos of that, very much apropos of that. I'm a media person, and I don't like public relations. I don't like people spinning, and I don't like people telling me what I should know about something I don't know enough about. I'd rather smell it and see it and feel it. One of the activities that Robbie's involved in and I'm engineering at Fletcher is on the warming Arctic. That's what I'm really doing, and it's got three elements: the policy, research, and public affairs. Now, what have we done about public affairs? Primarily aimed at the US audience right now. And we had Global Post, which is an online group, Living on Earth, which is a radio group, and Alaska Dispatch also, but also Frontline and the NewsHour indirectly as a consortium to more accurately tell the story of the Arctic, starting with Alaska, as you well know. Now, two of them came up, two of these individuals, editors of these enterprises who had never been in Alaska, came up here in late August and then went out on aside from being part of a conference here on the Arctic Imperative, they also went out to 6 or 8 places around the state, very remote places. They were thrilled by, I mean, they got all the excitement about Alaska that I have and that all of you have. That's fine. But they've also, in their own way, they're telling this story. If you look at Global Post today, they've started a new, I don't know if you looked at it, I actually looked at it today. Well, they started as a special report on the Arctic with 8 stories. That Charlie wrote 2 of them, I wrote 1, some of blah, blah, blah. And nobody told him what to do. The editor came up here, he felt it, he said this is one hell of a story, and it's coming out in that way, and it's going to be hitting a lot of people. Now, some of the stories you aren't going to like because it's either not fully complete, it's a new experience for him. He wrote 2 of the stories, and one of them I think is a little superficial, but superficial by somebody with their head in the right on his shoulders is far better than no story at all, and a hell of a lot better than any PR story, as you would agree, I'm thinking. So I guess my feeling is the real thing is to get people up here who are communicators, scholars, journalists, scientists, who circulate in different communities than the communities of the Arctic. I think that is the key, really. And maybe that sounds simple, but I think the world gets, that is what I feel. Sir?
How effective is public diplomacy internationally? Because we have seen with all the problems we face in the world today, it's like nobody's able to transmit anything, anywhere, any new places. How is that affecting public diplomacy?
You mean how is public diplomacy having an impact on some of the problems of the world?
Yes, and how
Well, I think it really doesn't have much of an impact because public diplomacy, if public diplomacy applies to the Arctic Council, it's one of the first where it would be applying to a consortium of countries rather than a particular country. There's a difference there. It isn't something, I mean, the UN per se doesn't have any public diplomacy activity. The WTO had nothing, and the EU did, but by and large, it isn't designed to have a impact on international issues that are highly negative. They're really primarily by governments or private sectors that have their own idioms or whatever, if you see the point I'm making. I don't mean to suggest that public diplomacy is a way for the world to get it's a very competitive field, because what Argentina is projecting in public diplomacy with Tango Argentino is competitive with what Colombia is projecting on Café de Colombia, or what Brazil is projecting in terms of the beautiful game. They all want the same thing. They all want tourists, they all want to be loved, and they all want trade, and they can't all get it. So it's a very competitive rather than collective activity. I'm glad you asked the question because that's important to realize. Ma'am?
Just recently I was trying to do some research on what public diplomacy is, so I went on the State Department's website, and this was in the wake of the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Libya, and they noted that the U.S. government was airing these, I think TV or radio spots kind of to quell the violence that was going on and kind of say that the U.S. government was not connected to that anti-Islamic
Yep.
tone. So I thought that was a pretty tangible example of public diplomacy in action, and I was trying to figure out, well, how else is the U.S. government doing this in the Middle East to kind of further the goals of the Arab Spring? Like, do you have any examples of that?
These are all great questions. Number one, the U.S., what was regarded to be the most effective thing over the last 10, 12, 15 years that the U.S. government was doing in terms of public diplomacy was the cultural libraries in most U.S. embassies. And they were something, I was a foreign correspondent a lot, and a lot of people went to them in places like the Philippines or Thailand or other places. They wanted to see American literature, they wanted to see American DVDs, they wanted to hear lectures, etc. Those have almost all of them have been closed now, because as things, wasn't because they weren't effective, it's because they became targets like McDonald's to people that were unhappy with U.S. policies, and which came up obviously more than anything because of the war in Iraq. And so almost all of those are closed. I guess, yeah, it's very complicated, but I guess I feel that U.S. governments, by and large, even the example you mentioned, it's a great idea. They should do that, but I doubt it had much impact at all. I think social media would have far more impact, and the U.S. government is not going to control what's out in social media. Clearly, there are plenty of people that knew that film was just ridiculous, and gradually it's going to come out in a lot of different ways. And I don't mean to be cavalier in what I'm saying, but I think it's very tough for a government like ours today, with all the baggage that we have, to have impact on something